Jim Morrison, the Manson murders, President Nixon, and the FBI. In this video, I'm going to explain how they all overlap with each other. Nixon and the FBI considered Jim Morrison dangerous. They considered him subversive. As one of the leading figures of the hippie movement of the anti-Vietnam War movement, Jim Morrison was not somebody that the government looked upon nicely. The Miami incident gave them the public cover they needed to finally go after Jim very aggressively. I've discussed the Miami incident previously, but for those of you who may not be familiar with it, on March 1st, 1969, during a Doors concert in Miami, Jim Morrison allegedly pulled out his private in front of a packed house. To this day, there is no definitive evidence to prove or disprove that Jim did that. But regardless of the lack of evidence, this alleged incident led to a massive public controversy which the FBI and President Nixon used to their advantage against Jim. I'll be discussing exactly what they did to Jim momentarily. But first, I want to say thank you to those of you who watched my previous documentary about Jim Morrison, Charles Manson, and the Miami incident. These seemingly unconnected stories are part of a bigger picture. Several of you recommended I look at the books Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon by David McGowan, as well as the book Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s by Tom O'Neill. I have been reading both of those books and will be sharing with you some really eye-opening information. In this video here in particular, I will be reading to you a segment from Chaos where Tom O'Neill describes the Manson murders. After the murders took place, the police actually questioned Jim Morrison about the murders. It's still not clear why the police questioned Jim about Manson, but I'm hoping to uncover some more information about this. Now, the first thing I want to do here is read to you a quote from Jim Morrison, Life-Death Legend by Stephen Davis, where he breaks down how the FBI and President Nixon went after Jim. Quote, "The FBI files, the dossier concerning Jim Morrison, contains a report on the infamous Miami show from March 1st, 1969, where Jim allegedly pulled out his private. The name of the FBI informant is blacked out. The informant declared that Jim exposed himself. According to the file, the informant advised that he is conducting an investigation and warrants will be obtained for Jim Morrison's arrest on misdemeanor charges. The matter will be discussed with the Florida State Attorney's Office to determine if Jim Morrison can be charged with a felony." Now, on March 5th, 1969, a few days after the concert, Larry Mahoney, a young reporter for the Miami Herald, reported that the Miami police had issued an arrest warrant for Jim, charging indecent exposure and disorderly conduct by profanity. Jim Morrison was in big trouble, much bigger than anyone realized. Officials at both the FBI and the Nixon White House believe that Jim Morrison had previously made threats against President Nixon. Whether or not Jim actually threatened or was a threat to Nixon was irrelevant. This Miami case presented the authorities the perfect opportunity to finally shut Jim up. The FBI's notorious COINTELPRO operation was currently neutralizing, sometimes violently, the government's critics and perceived enemies. They were, for instance, already harassing John Lennon, who had made outraged statements against Nixon's policies. The details that can be gleaned over from Jim Morrison's censored FBI file, plus the prosecution and subsequent police threats against Jim, seem to indicate that no less than the director of the FBI himself, J. Edgar Hoover, may have had a hand in the persecution of Jim Morrison. President Nixon himself sent a letter of support to a quote-unquote rally for decency held at the Orange Bowl in Miami on March 23, 1969, to protest the behavior of Jim Morrison. Meanwhile, the Doors' lucrative tour was suddenly canceled. The Concert Hall's Management Association put out the word that the Doors were poison. Their insurance company canceled their policies. Big money dates in Jacksonville, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Toronto, Detroit, Boston, etc., were immediately spiked. Suddenly, almost mysteriously, the Doors dropped off the radio, as if they've been banned from airplay. And this wasn't just in March. For instance, scheduled summer shows in Seattle and Hawaii were also canceled. Rumors circulated that local FBI offices were warning promoters to stay away from the Doors. Letters concerning the quote-unquote filth the Doors were peddling continued to find their way to J. Edgar Hoover and were subsequently filed in the Doors' FBI dossier. The following year, in August of 1970, Jim Morrison was back in Florida for trial proceedings. It seemed obvious to various observers that Jim Morrison was being railroaded to prison under the watchful eye of the Nixon administration. Somebody was out to break the doors financially and physically. No one in the media was going to stand up for Jim in his hour of need. On October 14, 1970, Jim taped an interview with the rock magazine Circus. During this interview, Jim said he was facing prison time and that he was worried about it. In Jim's own words, he called the Miami trial more a political than a sexual scandal. Jim Morrison's first rub-in with the FBI, however, wasn't the Miami trial of '69. It goes back at least a year earlier to 1968.
February 1968. One morning, America woke up, turned on breakfast television, and watched in awe as a barefoot peasant militia battered American troops and took over the major cities of South Vietnam. This was the fabled Tet, Lunar New Year offensive, when the Viet Cong almost overran the South Vietnamese army and their American allies. South Vietnam was saved only after bloody pitched battles. Famous quote, "We had to destroy the village in order to save it." From that moment on, the great mass of Americans knew the Vietnam conflict was lost. The war dragged on for 7 more years at enormous and disgraceful costs to American lives. The Doors, to their credit, did their best to stop the carnage. They had been performing The Unknown Soldier, their acute and furious protest song, for the past several months. Their Soldier promo clip, meant to be broadcast but immediately banned for its violence and amateurish production values, was shown at Doors concerts beginning the following month. The audiences were stunned, and a few even realized they had seen one of the most intense anti-war statements that Americans had ever committed to film. It was around then, according to the heavily censored Federal Bureau of Investigation files on the Doors, that a group of radio executives in the South sent letters to the FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover suggesting that the Doors were disseminating enemy propaganda and damaging civilian morale with their obscene performances and anti-war messages.
End quote. In a few minutes, I'm going to read to you a quote from Chaos by Tom O'Neill, where he describes exactly what happened the night of the Manson murders. Tom O'Neill believes that Charles Manson may have been some sort of a CIA asset. I'm going to be exploring that subject in several upcoming videos. Now, some people believe that Jim Morrison may have also been a CIA asset. I covered this in my previous video about Jim and Manson, but for those of you who haven't seen it, here's a quick recap. Jim's father, George, was an important figure in the U.S. Navy, so much so that George Morrison was directly involved in the famous incident, which led to increased U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. On August 2, 1964, the U.S. Navy and the North Vietnamese Navy exchanged fire. George Morrison, Jim's dad, was in command of American forces during this confrontation. 4 North Vietnamese were killed and 6 more were wounded. On the American side, there were no casualties, but regardless, this incident, now known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, famously gave the Johnson administration the quote-unquote justification they needed to escalate U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. Some people find it too much of a coincidence that Jim Morrison, one of the biggest counterculture icons ever, had a father who was not only a prominent member of the U.S. Navy, but who was directly involved in the incident widely regarded as the catalyst for increased U.S. involvement in Vietnam. There is a theory out there that Jim Morrison may have been some sort of a CIA asset, a CIA plant. While I personally don't have a solid opinion on that just yet, Jim Morrison's potential ties to the government is something I'm currently reading on. Jim, of course, is not the only prominent figure from the 60s hippie scene that people believe may have been a government plant. Going back to Charles Manson, there are a lot of people who think he was a CIA asset of some sort. While this has never been confirmed, there is quite a bit of information which does suggest Manson may have had government ties. As mentioned, after the horrific Manson murders in August of '69, the police actually questioned Jim Morrison about the murders. The following is from Jim Morrison, Life-Death Legend by Stephen Davis. Quote, Charles Manson dispatched his witchy young legion into the town, where they butchered movie star Sharon Tate in her Beverly Hills home, which belonged to record producer Terry Melcher. Another victim that was murdered that night on August 9, 1969, was Jim Morrison's former hairstylist, Jay Sebring, along with 4 other victims.
Heavy-duty paranoia descended upon the land. About a month later, for reasons that remain unclear, Jim Morrison was questioned by police detectives investigating the Tate LaBianca murders. There was a rumor going around town that Jim had talked about the murders before they happened. Jim may have also been tied to the case through Sebring, or through connections in Topanga, where the Manson family had lived, or through acquaintances with one or more of Charlie's girls. Over the years, several of these still imprisoned women have claimed that they knew Jim Morrison, but similar claims about other contemporary celebrities are considered highly suspect and remain unproven.
End quote. I'm going to read to you now a quote from Tom O'Neill's book Chaos, where he discusses in gruesome detail the Tate LaBianca murders. Tom O'Neill did a fantastic job with this book, and I definitely recommend getting a copy if you want to learn the true story about what happened. Quote, August 8th, 1969. Late that night at the Spawn Movie Ranch near Chatsworth, Los Angeles, a man and 3 women got in a beat-up yellow 1959 Ford and headed towards Beverly Hills. A ranch hand heard one of the women say, "We're going to get some pigs." That woman was Susan Sadie Atkins, 21, who'd grown up mostly in San Jose. The daughter of 2 alcoholics, she said that her brother and his friends would often molest her. She had dropped out of high school and moved to San Francisco, where she'd worked as a topless dancer and gotten into LSD. "My family kept telling me, 'You're going downhill,'" she would later say. "So I just went downhill all the way to the bottom." Huddled beside her in the back of the car was Patricia Krenwinkel. 21, from Inglewood, Krenwinkel had developed a hormone problem as a kid, leading her to overeat and fear that she was ugly and unwanted. As a teen, she got into drugs and started to drink heavily. One day in 1967, she left her car in a parking lot, failed to collect the 2 paychecks from her job at an insurance company, and disappeared. In the passenger seat was Linda Kasabian, 20, from New Hampshire. She played basketball in high school, but she dropped out to get married. The union lasted less than 6 months. Not long after, in Boston, she was arrested in a narcotics bust. By the spring of 1968, she'd remarried, had a kid, and moved to Los Angeles. Sometimes she'd introduce herself as Yana the Witch. At the wheel was Charles Tex Watson, 23 and 6'3" from East Texas. Watson had been a Boy Scout and the captain of his high school football team. He'd sometimes help his dad, who ran a gas station and grocery store. At North Texas State University, he joined a fraternity and started getting stoned. Soon, he dropped out, moved to California, and got a job as a wig salesman. One day, he picked up a hitchhiker who turned out to be Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, a chance occurrence that changed both their lives forever. That night in August of 1969, in the yellow Ford, Tex, Susan, Patricia, and Linda were all dressed in black from head to toe. None of them had a history of violence. They were part of a hippie commune that called itself the Family and lived in isolation at the abandoned Spawn Ranch. More than anything, the family lived in accordance to the whims of their leader, the 34-year-old Charles Manson, who had commanded the 4 of them to take their trip that night in August. The 4 arrived at 150 Cielo Drive, where the actress Sharon Tate lived with her husband, the filmmaker Roman Polanski. Polanski was away in London at the time, scouting locations for The Day of the Dolphin, a movie in which a dolphin is trained to assassinate the President of the United States. The drive to Cielo would have taken about 40 minutes. It was just after midnight when they arrived. It was quiet there, seemingly worlds away from the hustle and sprawl of Los Angeles. The Tate House, built in 1942, had belonged to a French actress who'd modeled it on the Norman country estates of her youth. This beautiful house sat on 3 acres of isolated land nestled against a hillside. From this house, you could see views of Los Angeles glittering to the east and Bel Air's fulsome estates unfurling to the west. On a clear day, you could see straight to the Pacific 10 miles out. Anyways, Tex Watson scaled a pole to sever the phone lines to the house. Tex had been here before, and he knew where to find them right away. There was an electric gate leading to the driveway, but instead of activating it, the 4 elected to jump over an embankment and drop onto the main property. All of them were carrying buck knives. Watson also had a .22 buntline revolver. Kasabian remained on the outskirts, keeping watch. The other 3 crept up the hill toward the secluded estate. At the top of the driveway, they found Stephen Parent, an 18-year-old in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was there visiting the caretaker in the guest house to sell him a clock radio. He was sitting in his dad's white car, having already rolled his window down to activate the gate control. Tex approached the driver's side of the car and pointed his gun at Stephen's face. "Please don't hurt me. I won't say anything," Stephen screamed, raising his arm to protect himself. Tex slashed his left hand with the knife, slicing through the strap of his wristwatch. Then he shot Parent 4 times, in his arm, his left cheek, and twice in the chest. Parent died instantly, his blood beginning to pool in the car. Those 4 shots rang out through the air, but no one in the house at 150 Cielo seemed to hear them. It was a rustic home of stone and wood. Finding no open windows or doors, Tex cut a long horizontal slit in a window screen outside the dining room and gained entry into the house. He went to the front door to let Atkins and Krenwinkel in. In the living room, the 3 killers came across Wojtek Frykowski, a 32-year-old Polish émigré and an aspiring filmmaker, asleep on the couch with an American flag draped over it. Rubbing his eyes to make out the figures clad in black and standing over him, Wojtek stretched his arms and, apparently mistaking the Manson family for friends, asked them, "What time is it?" Tex aimed his gun at Wojtek and said, "Be quiet, don't move, or you're dead." Wojtek stiffened, the gravity of the situation beginning to seize him. "Who are you?" he asked, "and what are you doing here?" "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business," Tex replied, kicking Wojtek in the head. Susan Atkins then found a towel and used it to bind Wojtek's hands as best as she could. Then, on Tex's instructions, she looked through the house, searching for others. She came to a bedroom where she saw a woman reclining on a bed, reading. Abigail Folger, 25, the heiress to a coffee fortune. She'd been staying at the house with Wojtek, who was her boyfriend since April. Now, she glanced up from her book, smiled, and waved at Atkins, not realizing the danger. For her part, Atkins responded in kind and continued down the hall. Crazy. Atkins peered into a second bedroom, where a man sat on the edge of a bed, talking to a pregnant woman who lay there in lingerie. The man, Jay Sebring, 35, was a hairstylist. His shop in Beverly Hills attracted a wealthy, famous clientele. He'd been the first one to cut hair in a private room as opposed to a barber shop. He'd served in the Navy during the Korean War. An intensely secretive man, he was rumored to allow only 5 people to keep his phone number. On the bed with him was his ex-girlfriend, Sharon Tate, then 26 and 8.5 months pregnant with her first child. She'd recently filmed her biggest role to date in 13 Chairs, and her manager had promised she'd be a star someday. Born in Dallas, Texas, Tate was the daughter of an Army officer. She grew up in cities scattered across the globe. Her beauty was such that she'd apparently stopped traffic, literally, on her first visit to New York. She'd been a homecoming queen and a prom queen. Even at 6 months old, she'd won a Miss Tiny Tot contest in Texas. A film career, she hoped, would get her noticed for something beyond her good looks. There, on Cielo Drive, at the home she called the Love House, Tate was optimistic about her future. She believed her child would strengthen her marriage with Polanski, who sometimes demeaned her. Now, having reported back to Tex, Susan retied Wojtek's hands with a piece of nylon rope. She went to bring the others into the living room, returning with Folger at knife point, and then with Sebring and Tate. "Come with me," she told them. "Don't say a word, or you're dead." In their shock and confusion, they offered the intruders money and whatever else they wanted, begging them not to hurt anyone. Tex ordered the 3 who'd come from their bedrooms to lie face down on their stomachs in front of the fireplace. Sharon Tate began to cry. Tex told her to shut up. Taking a long rope, he tied Sebring's hands behind his back and ran a length around his neck. He looped the rope around Tate's neck next and then Folger's, throwing the rest of it over a beam in the ceiling. Sebring struggled to his feet and protested. Couldn't this man see that Tate was pregnant? He tried to move towards Sharon, and Tex shot him, puncturing a lug. Sebring crumbled onto the zebra skin rug by the fireplace. Since they were all tied together, his collapse forced the screaming Tate and Folger to stand on their toes, to keep them from being strangled. Tex dropped to his knees and began stabbing the hairstylist incessantly. Standing up again, he kicked Sebring in the head. Then he told Krenwinkel to turn off all the lights. "What are you going to do to us?" Sharon Tate asked. "You're all going to die," Tex said. Wojtek had managed to free his hands. He lunged towards Atkins, attempting to disarm her. But she forced her knife into his legs, stabbing him constantly as they rolled across the living room floor, a tangle of limbs glinting with steel. He pulled her long hair, his blood spraying everywhere, and he'd been stabbed more than 6 times. But Wojtek staggered to his feet. Atkins had lost her knife, so he made a run for the front door, and with Atkins still pummeling him, got as far as the lawn. Tex shot him with 2 bullets and then tackled him to the ground, pounding the butt of his gun against the back of his head again and again. He hit him with such force that Wojtek's skull cracked. Inside, Sharon was sobbing. Then Folger, who lifted the noose from her neck, ran down the hall and out the house through a side door. She was halfway across the front lawn when Krenwinkel caught up to her and brought her knife down, stabbing her 28 times. Tex joined in and Folger went limp, saying, "I give up. I'm already dead." Drenched in blood and their own sweat, the 2 killers rose to see Wojtek yet again on his feet stumbling towards them. Soon, they were stabbing him with the same mechanical precision, forcing steel through flesh, bone, and cartilage. The coroner tallied 51 stab wounds to Wojtek, plus 13 blows to the head and 2 bullet wounds. Atkins had remained in the house with Sharon, who was whimpering, sitting on the floor, still only in lingerie and bound by the neck to the dead body of her former lover, Jay Sebring. She was the only one still alive. She was due to give birth to the child, a boy, in 2 weeks. Tex came back inside and ordered Atkins to kill her. Tate begged her to spare her life, to spare her unborn child. "I want to have my baby," she said. "Woman, I have no mercy for you," Atkins responded, locking her arm around Tate's neck from behind. "You're going to die, and I don't feel anything about it." She stabbed her in the stomach. Tex joined in, and the pair stabbed her 16 times until she cried out for her mother and died. Atkins dipped her fingers into one of Tate's wounds and tasted her blood. It was, quote, "warm, sticky, and nice," she'd later recall. "To taste death and yet give life," she said. Wow, what a trick. She soaked a towel in Tate's blood and brought it to the front door, where, following Tex's instruction to write something that would shock the world, she scrawled the word pig. Their work was done. When Watson, Atkins, and Krenwinkel and Kasabian returned to the Spawn Ranch early that morning, they went to their beds and slept soundly. "I was gone," Atkins later recalled. "It was like I was dead. I could not think about anything. It was almost as if I passed out, blacked out. My head was blank. There was nothing in me. It was like I had given it all." At 150 Cielo Drive was a scene of such callous, barbarous devastation that it shook something loose in the national psyche. August 8th and August 9th suddenly seemed to describe different realities. Media accounts were quick to infer something more sordid than ordinary homicide, something occult had occurred. One paper called the murders a, quote, bloody orgy. Others reported ritualistic slayings and overtones of a weird religious rite. The facts were unavailable or misreported. Maybe drugs were involved. Maybe they weren't. Maybe Sebring had been wearing a black hood of a Satanist. Maybe he hadn't. The big picture was one of supernatural ruin. An officer at the scene said the bodies looked like mannequins dipped in red paint. Another said, "It's like a battlefield up there." Pools of blood had soaked into the carpets. According to Time magazine, stray bullets were lodged in the ceiling. In Roman Polanski, whose films were errantly, even proudly occultist, the public found someone onto whom it could project its fatalism. A popular press account said that mere minutes before he learned of the murders, Polanski, at a party in London, had been discussing a friend's death. "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo," he said. "Who will be the next to go?" With that, the phone rang and he was summoned to hear that his wife and friends had been brutally murdered. But it wasn't over. The next night at the Spawn Ranch, the same group convened with 3 additions. There was 18-year-old Stephen Grogan, a musician and high school dropout, and the 19-year-old Leslie Van Houten, a former homecoming princess from the suburbs of Los Angeles. And then there was Charles Manson, their leader. The 7 of them piled into the beat-up Ford on a search for more victims. After nearly 3 hours of restive driving through Los Angeles and its environs, Manson finally settled on a home in Los Feliz, at 3301 Waverly Drive, next door to a house he'd once stayed in. Manson broke into the house by himself, armed with a pistol and a knife. Others maintained that he brought Tex Watson with him. In any case, he spotted Leno LaBianca, 44 years old, a grocery store owner, asleep on the couch. Leno's wife, Rosemary, 38 years old, was in the bedroom. Rosemary was paranoid that people had been breaking in and moving their furniture around lately, and, like the whole city, she was spooked by the Tate murders the previous night. Even so, Manson was apparently able to walk right in through an unlocked door. and he tied up the couple by himself. Then, Manson rejoined his followers at the bottom of the long driveway where they were waiting in the car. Manson chose Tex and Krenwinkel again as his executioners. This time he added Van Houten to the mix too. She'd never so much as struck a person before that night. Regardless, he told the three of them to go inside and kill everyone. They had only buck knives. They burst into the house, separated the couple, and stabbed Leno 26 times. They carved the word war into his stomach and impaled a carving fork beside it, its handle jutting out of his belly. And they left a steak knife protruding from his neck. Rosemary suffered 41 stab wounds, many inflicted after she'd already died. Before they left, the killer scrawled "Helter Skelter" in blood on the refrigerator, a reference to the Beatles song Helter Skelter, though they misspelt it. On the walls, they smeared "Rise" and "Death to Pigs" in Leno's blood. The bloodshed in its primitive defiance, a pregnant star slaughtered, a man punctured with kitchen utensils, confirmed a sense of rupture in America. The 60s subversive spirit had come on with too much fervor. Some reckoning was bound to happen, or so it seemed in retrospect. The nation was immured in these events, in the motive, the manhunt, and then in 1970, the sensational 9.5-month-long trial. But after the murders, Manson and his followers were not brought to justice for nearly 4 months. With the suspects unknown and at large, rumors proliferated and the tension reached a fever pitch. For a while, the police maintained that the two sets of murders, the LaBianca Tate murders, were unrelated. They claimed the LaBiancas were the victims of a copycat attack. As days turned into weeks and weeks to months, two separate teams of LAPD detectives, one assigned to Tate, the other to the LaBiancas, failed to share information, believing that the crimes were unconnected. As they lost valuable time pursuing false leads, doubt and ridicule followed them in the press. For almost 4 months, the police would say that they had no real idea who had committed the murders, some of the most appalling murders in the history of the country. As journalist Joan Didion famously stated, the 60s abruptly ended on August 9, 1969. The tension broke that day. The paranoia was fulfilled. There's a germ of truth in what she said, but the process wasn't so abrupt. It began that day, but it wasn't over really until December 1st, 1969. The day the police announced the crimes had been solved and the nation got its first glimpse of the killers. Here was the final fulfillment of that paranoia, the last gasp of 60s idealism. At LAPD headquarters, the chief of police, Edward M. Davis, stepped up to an array of 15 microphones and announced to a stunned crowd of 200 reporters that the case was solved. Warrants were out for Charles Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian. More people would be named pending grand jury indictments. Davis added, to everyone's astonishment, that the Tate LaBianca murders were connected. The suspects may have been responsible for a series of other unresolved homicides too. Police Chief Davis didn't name Manson or Susan Atkins that day because they were already in custody. In mid-October, Manson, with a welter of his followers, had been apprehended on auto theft charges at the Barker Ranch, a hideaway in the forbidding Death Valley, several hours away from Los Angeles. Its seclusion surpassed even that of the Spahn Ranch. Atkins had been charged with another unrelated murder, that of Gary Hinman, an old friend of Manson. She was being held at the Sybil Brand Institute, a jail for women in Los Angeles County, where she bragged to cellmates about her complicity in the Tate murders. Those offhand remarks broke the case open for the LAPD, who began to connect the dots they'd been staring at for nearly 4 months. Journalists dug into the story. Images of Manson and the family were emblazoned on front pages and TV screens around the world. The cognitive dissonance was intense. These weren't the faces of hardened criminals or escaped lunatics. They were hippies, stereotypical flower children. In the bloom of wide-eyed youth, the men unshaven and long-haired, wearing beads and buckskin jackets. The women in blue jeans and tie-dyed tops, no bras, and their hair tangled and unwashed. They talk like hippies, too, spouting an ethos of free love, eschewing monogamy and marriage in favor of sexual experimentation. They lived in roaming communes, caravanning along the Golden Coast in Technicolor bright buses and clunkers cobbled together from spare parts. They believed that hallucinations strengthened the spirit and expanded the mind. They gave birth naturally and raised their children together in rustic simplicity. In other ways, though, their philosophy was Gnostic, verging on theological. Time did not exist, they proclaimed. There was no good, no bad, and no death. All human beings were God and the devil at the same time and part of one another. The family's moral code, insofar as it existed at all, was riven with contradictions. While it was wrong to kill animals, according to their philosophy, even the snakes and spiders in their bunkhouses had to be carefully spared. It was fine to kill people, because, according to them, human life was inherently valueless. To kill a person was tantamount to, quote, breaking off a minute piece of some cosmic cookie, as Tex Watson later put it. If anything, according to their philosophy, death was something to be embraced, because it exposed your soul to the oneness of the universe. Where had these beliefs come from? The murderers had been raised and educated for the most part in solid conventional American communities. So what happened? The promise of the hippie movement had been in its willingness to forego cherished institutions in favor of the new and untested. The Manson family, with its starry-eyed communalism, sexual frankness, and veneration of LSD, offered a screen onto which anyone could project his insecurities about the era's politics and pressures. After the Tate murders, it seemed that hippies and freaks were more than a risible sideshow. They could really undermine the status quo. Their promiscuity had always earned a lot of finger-wagging from concerned moralists, while others had looked on with thinly veiled envy. Parents were worried about their kids, that they would drop out, become hippies, and never get decent jobs. Everywhere, kids were hitchhiking. The consensus from the quote-unquote straight world was that hippies were mostly harmless, but you didn't want to be one. While there had been isolated incidents of violence attributed to hippies, none of it was as horrific, premeditated, or systematic as the murders committed by the Manson family. On December 12th, a piece in Time magazine drew parallels between hippies and violence. In the movement's Invitation to Freedom, the magazine warned, criminals and psychotics blossomed as easily as innocents and pacifists did. But how, Time asked, could children who had dropped out for the sake of kindness and caring, love and beauty, end up killing? End quote. This is one of the main arguments that the author Tom O'Neill is making with this book. I'm not really giving anything away here because he's done several interviews about this, where he discusses that his theory is that what happened with the Mansons wasn't some sort of random act, but rather Manson was a CIA asset, and that these murders were meant to put a massive stain on the hippie movement, because the government considered the hippie movement a threat in many regards. I'm paraphrasing here essentially, I'm oversimplifying it, but basically, this is one of the main arguments Tom O'Neill makes. Now, one of the biggest and most influential faces of the hippie movement was Jim Morrison. And as I mentioned earlier, the government wanted to shut him up. The Miami incident gave the powers that be the perfect justification to go after Jim and to try to shut him down. The following is the full history of the Miami incident and all the crazy details involving Jim and law enforcement. Again, I've covered this subject in a previous video, but for those of you who aren't familiar with the in-depth history of what happened, here it is. This is from Jim Morrison, Life, Death, Legend by Stephen Davis. Quote,
It was late February 1969 and the Doors were going back on tour. The plan was for Jim Morrison and Pamela Corson to fly to Miami together. But on the last day of February, as they were packing their bags, Jim and Pam got into a horrendous fight. Jim Morrison was extremely upset. In the limo on the way to the airport, the fight escalated into near violence, and Jim told Pam that she had to go home. She wasn't coming along. Jim would go to Miami and on to Jamaica by himself. Jim Morrison was furious now, and some band, was going to pay dearly. A few weeks earlier, the students at the University of Miami had been polled to find out their favorite rock group, which would be invited to play at the school just prior to spring break. The students chose the Doors, and the band had been invited to play at the Convocation Hall in Miami Beach. But the band's management accepted instead a better offer of $25,000 from local Miami promoters, who had more experience putting on rock shows. The Doors' problems in Miami started days before the band left Los Angeles. The local promoters, who ran The Image, Miami's Electric Ballroom, had a bad reputation. Other California bands told Doors manager Bill Siddons that they had been ripped off by The Image, which oversold halls and underreported gross ticket sales. On Saturday, March 1st, 1969, the Doors and their gear flew to Miami without Jim, who missed the flight. Bill Siddons waited at LAX until Jim showed up and sent Pamela home. As Siddons recalls,
We found a flight that went through New Orleans where we had a couple of drinks at the airport bar. By the time we got to Miami, I noticed that Jim's facial muscles had slackened, the only way I could tell how drunk he was. So I knew he was real drunk on the way to the gig. The Miami promoters had met the earlier plane and loaded the Doors' brand new tour equipment into their truck. When Siddons arrived, hours later, with a stone-drunk Jim, the Doors' booking agent informed Siddons that the promoters had removed the seats from the so-called Dinner Key Auditorium. In reality, an old seaplane hangar reeking of filth and damp, and had oversold the hall by thousands of tickets. When Siddons, backed up by his black detectives, threatened that the Doors wouldn't play, the promoter and his brother, a karate black belt supervising a thuggish crew, countered that the Doors wouldn't see their expensive new equipment again unless they appeared as contracted that night. Siddons told an interviewer later that the brothers threatened him if the band didn't play. No one said a word as Jim staggered into the dressing room. Jim was heavily bearded and wore a full black ensemble with a silver cross around his neck and a black leather broad-brimmed hat banded with a silver skull and crossbones pulled down over his blazing eyes. He looked about as dread as it was possible for a rock star to look in 1969. Jim Morrison was home, back in Florida for the first time in years. He was about as drunk as one could be and still put on a rough semblance of a rock show. Jim checked out the audience before he went on. Uncounted thousands of kids, mostly teenagers, crammed against a flimsy stage at one end of an evil-smelling old barn. Jim was, unwisely, briefed on the contentious, extortionate vibes of the show, the dodgy promoters, the threats. The band's agent said that it was the worst venue he'd ever seen. Vince Triner warned the band that the stage was poorly built and could collapse. By showtime, Jim was mad as hell and totally liquored up. He proceeded to destroy his career in his family's home state. The worst and one of the most important rock concerts in history started late. John Densmore noticed immediately that the stage was shaking. Promoter Ken Collier, flashing the V-fingered peace sign, introduced the band by asking the audience to keep it cool. A tape made by an audience member captured a series of off-key harmonica notes played by Jim as the band tuned up on stage. Thousands of Kodak Instamatics flashed like lightning bolts. Kids were shouting stuff at Jim and he responded. "Yeah, okay, right on, looky here. I ain't talking about no revolution and I ain't talking about no demonstration. I'm talking about having a good time," Jim shouted. He told the crowd they all should come to LA that summer and rub their toes in the sand. Then he pumped it up. "Are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready?" Then the door started pounding out Backdoor Man. Robbie Krieger recalls the following. Jim started rapping Rock is Dead instead of singing. He was pissed off. People were expecting a freak show instead of rock and roll when they came to see the Doors, and he hated this. He was venting his anger on this audience. End quote. Jim began cursing and shouting obscenities. The band got through the first two verses and into Robbie's solo. Someone threw a plastic bottle of orange Dayglow paint, which burst on the stage, splattering Jim and Robbie. Jim was now making sexual remarks towards the audience. He then started soliciting people from the audience. "Hey, listen, I'm lonely. I need some love. Come on." As Jim invited the audience onto the stage to give him love, the band shifted into 5-1. Jim managed the first two verses of the song, and then Robbie played his spiky guitar solo. Jim, enraged, started cursing even more now towards the audience. Jim paused as John Densmore pounded on, and the audience noise rose to howls of protest and alarm. Jim Morrison went on. "Maybe you love getting pushed around. You love it, don't you?" Jim Morrison jumped back into singing 5-1. "Your ballroom days are over." And then he continued talking to the audience. "Hey, I'm not talking about no revolution, no demonstration. I'm talking about getting out in the streets. I'm talking about having some fun. I'm talking about dancing. I'm talking about loving your neighbor until it hurts." The audience at this point had turned into a churning tidal mass of flesh. The band started Touch Me, but Jim wasn't in the mood. He took off his leather coat and threw it into the crowd. He traded hats with a cop and then threw both of them into the crowd. The band kept trying to play Touch Me. "Hey, wait a minute. Hey, wait a minute. This is all messed up. You blew it too fast. Wait a minute. I'm not going to go on." The band kept playing, but Jim was adamant. "Now, wait a minute. I'm not going to take this. I'm copping out, man." Ray Manzarek stopped playing, then started again and stopped when Jim wouldn't sing. The band started up Love Me Two Times, which Jim performed in a dead monotone. He then began to make obscene sexual gestures on stage. The band then went into When the Music's Over, and Jim sang as if he were underwater, slurring his lyrics to incomprehensibility. Then Jim began ranting again. "Hey, listen, I used to think this whole thing was a big joke. I used to think it was something to laugh about. And then the last couple of nights, I met some people who were doing something.
They're doing something, and I want to get on that trip. I want to change the world. Yeah, change it. Come on. The first thing we're going to do is take over the schools. Then we're going to... Jim paused to halt a fight in front of the stage and went into a new vocal riff, away in India, as the band vamped on a blues progression. For the next 5 minutes, Jim spoke with the kids up front. He asked for a cigarette and dozens were thrown on stage. He told the crowd he was from Florida. You know I was born right here in this state. You know that. Yeah, I was born right here in Melbourne, Florida in 1943. He went on in this vein, insisting he wasn't talking about no revolution, no demonstration. He grabbed at his crotch, teasing the crowd. Someone yelled, "Take it off." Hecklers began to curse as Jim chanted more anarchic exhortations and eventually concluded when the music's over. Then he screamed, "Wake up," and recited the Lizard stanza, which led into Light My Fire. During the solos, Jim's friend Louis Beach Marvin, the Topanga Supermarket Premium Heir, handed Jim a live lamb. Marvin had planned to follow the Doors tour with the lamb, which he regarded as a symbol of the vegan pacifism he espoused. Jim held the lamb to his chest. 5,000 flashbulbs went off. Later, he remembered being surprised that the lamb was so placid and unafraid. He could even feel its heart beating. As the band finished Light My Fire, Jim began grabbing at his private parts and exhorting the crowd to come up on the stage. All right, I want to see some action out there. He yelled this 5 times. I want to see you people come up on here and have some fun. Come on now, let's get on up here. No limits, no laws. Come on, let's do it. People jumped on the stage. Someone poured champagne over Jim's head. Off mic, Jim asked the kids if they wanted to see his private region and began unbuckling his belt. Everyone could see he was wearing boxer shorts, which interested the band because Jim hardly ever wore underwear. Vince, Ray Manzarek yelled over to Vince Trenor, the tour manager, "Don't let him do it." And Trenor ran on stage and stuck his thumbs in the waistband of Jim's leather pants. That way he couldn't pull them down. Nevertheless, Jim continued to posture sexually on stage. Thousands of flashbulbs recorded the scene. Promoter Ken Collier ran on the stage and told Jim, "Someone's gonna get hurt." Jim brushed him off and yelled, "We're not leaving until everyone gets their rocks off." Jim grabbed his underregion and seemed about to take off his pants when Collier's brother tried to take the microphone away. Jim pushed him off stage. One of the local karate guys then grabbed Jim and flipped him over his back into the crowd, who caught him. Landing on his feet, Jim led the audience in a wild pagan snake dance around the cavernous room. In Bill Siddon's words, the band manager, the audience looked like a giant whirlpool with Jim at the center. Then, the stage itself began to tilt and collapse. John and Robbie stopped playing and ran for the dressing room. When John jumped off the sinking stage, he landed on the light board, which crashed apart in a sparking fury. Ray Manzarek recalled the following in an interview 25 years later. It was Dionysus calling forth the snakes. The stage was collapsing. I played the riot, screaming, crunching chords. Part of me was saying, we're in serious trouble here. But I knew that Jim never actually exposed himself. What happened in Miami was a mass hallucination. After the shirt had been ripped from his back, Jim extricated himself from the Bachanal, followed by local photographer Jeff Simon, who snapped a picture of a bleary, bare-chested Jim on the balcony a few moments later, surveying with dazed satisfaction the aftermath of the chaotic scene he had orchestrated. The Miami concert and the Doors as originally conceived were over. Not much was said after that disastrous and fateful Miami show in March of 1969. It was, after all, just another royally screwed-up Doors gig. The band even laughed off the show with the off-duty Miami cops who were providing security backstage. Jim had sobered up and spoke about wanting to change the band's direction. When the hall was emptied, discarded clothes, underwear, and shoes were swept into the middle of the floor in a huge pile, measuring 5 feet high. The Doors road crew rounded up their amps and prepared to truck them to the band's next gig in Jacksonville, Florida on March 9th. However, there was trouble in Miami now. Larry Mahoney was a young reporter from the Miami Herald who had been a student at FSU at the same time as Jim and may have known him there. 2 days after the Miami show, Mahoney began writing inflammatory articles about the Doors' appearance, one of which suggested that Jim Morrison had exposed himself at the Dinner Key Auditorium. In his write-up entitled, "Rock Group Fails to Stir a Riot" on March 3rd, Mahoney reported that Jim flouted the laws of obscenity, indecent exposure, and incitement to riot. In Mahoney's words, quote, "Many of the nearly 12,000 youths said they found the bearded singer's exhibition disgusting. Included in the audience were hundreds of unescorted junior and senior high school girls. Morrison appeared to expose himself. He also got violent, slugged several of the Image officials, and threw one of them off the stage before he himself was hurled into the crowd." End quote.
The band's tour manager Vince Trenor saw this article before he left Miami and called manager Bill Siddons in alarm. They both knew that Jim hadn't unveiled his considerable manhood. Neither had taken their eyes off him during the performance. Larry Mahoney then began leading a press campaign against the Doors. He called Miami's acting police chief and asked reporter-type questions. He called the Dade County District Attorney. Did they know a rock star had exposed himself in Coconut Grove? The cops tried to defend themselves, saying they had been too busy dealing with 2,500 ticketless fans outside the hall to arrest the star of the show. The FBI dossier concerning Jim Morrison contains a report on the show. The name of the informant is blacked out. Drawing on Mahoney's reporting, the informant declared that Jim exposed himself. Quote, "Informant advised that he is conducting an investigation and warrants will be obtained for Morrison's arrest on misdemeanor charges. The matter will be discussed with the Florida State Attorney's Office to determine if Morrison can be charged with a felony." End quote. On March 5th, Mahoney reported that the Miami police had issued an arrest warrant for Jim, charging indecent exposure and disorderly conduct by profanity. An assistant state attorney was said to have taken a statement from one of his office boys that Jim had displayed his private and that the state of Florida was considering pressing charges. It was all rubbish. There were several professional photographers covering the concert that night and thousands of flash cameras. The only image that comes close to indecent exposure is one where Jim has one hand in his pants and another reaching for his crotch. But regardless, Jim Morrison was in big trouble, much bigger than anyone realized. Officials at both the FBI and in the White House still believe that Jim had made threats against the famously paranoid Nixon. The FBI's notorious COINTELPRO operation was currently neutralizing, sometimes violently, the government's critics and perceived enemies. They were already harassing John Lennon, who had made outrageous statements against Nixon's policies. The thuggish prosecution and subsequent police threats against Jim Morrison jibe with what details can be gleaned from his censored FBI file to indicate that the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, may have had a hand in the persecution of Jim Morrison. Meanwhile, the Doors' lucrative tour was suddenly canceled. The Concert Halls Management Association, CHMA, put out the word that the Doors were poison. Their insurance company canceled their policies. Big money dates in Jacksonville, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Providence, Toronto, Detroit, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Boston, Buffalo, Dallas, Houston, and others were immediately spiked. Suddenly, almost mysteriously, the Doors dropped off the radio, as if they've been banned from airplay. The band's manager Bill Siddons reached the group who were vacationing in the Caribbean and told them that the tour was off, suggesting they return to LA instead. Jim was warned that he could be arrested if he landed in Florida, so he caught a flight to New York instead on March 8th. At this time in early March of 1969, everyone around the Doors was completely freaked out about the canceled tour and the enormous loss of revenue, all of which happened as a result of the controversy coming from the Miami show, except for Jim Morrison. He seemed relieved. The whole thing had been on his shoulders and now he was free. He came home to LA and met with his lawyers about what to do. He kept growing his beard, put on some weight, and dressed down. On and off girlfriend Pamela Corson supposedly told friends that Jim had admitted to her that he had flashed his meat in Miami. She asked him why he had done it, and Jim said, "Honey, I just wanted to see what it looked like in the spotlight." This is probably apocryphal, an exaggeration, but Elmer Valentine, who owned the whiskey, also claimed that Jim told him he thought he might have fished it out. With time on his hands, Jim immersed himself in other interests. He published the poem Dry Water in the Los Angeles Image, a counterculture magazine. Sometime in March, the tapes are undated, Jim gathered his notebooks and taped more than an hour's worth of poems, lyrics, and fragments in either Elektra Studio or at Sunset Sound. The engineer was John Haney, who had been Elektra's chief engineer since the beginning of the year. This recording session yielded 40 spoken-word Morrison poems, some of which, Bird of Prey, Under Waterfall, Orange Country, were sung by Jim a cappella as if musical accompaniment could be recorded later. Among the pieces were Indians Scattered on Dawn's Highway, sections of An American Prayer, 2 verses of Texas Radio, Stoned Immaculate, and Motel Money Murder Madness. There were also several fragments that were later united into a posthumous poem, Far Arden. Arden was the family name of William Shakespeare's mother, and the Forest of Arden is the setting for William Shakespeare's play As You Like It. Jim spoke, chanted, and sang in a bell-clear baritone, reading from his notebooks in carefully thought-out cadences, as if he had rehearsed material he had repeatedly polished and refined. Some have speculated that these tapes were meant to be released in some form if Jim went to jail for the Miami concert. Portions of these poems were eventually adapted and used by the Doors to carry on Jim's image long after he had died. Poets and critics who have heard these visionary taped experiments agree that Jim Morrison was creating a new American poetry that worked on a very high level, one that didn't necessarily transpose successfully to the printed page. Ray Manzarek claims the Doors confronted Jim about his drinking at a band meeting at Robbie's parents' house in the Pacific Palisades, where the Doors had worked on some of the soft parade songs. In his memoir, Ray said they had all told him he was drinking too much and that it looked like he was killing himself. According to Manzarek, Jim acknowledged his problem, saying simply and sadly, "I know I drink too much, Ray. I'm trying to quit." That was enough for the Doors. Jim knew it was what they wanted to hear, so he didn't quit. He just kept boozing with Babe Hill at the Palms. Max Fink, Jim Morrison's Beverly Hills attorney, was contacted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation late in March concerning criminal charges against Jim relating to the Doors' Miami concert. The FBI got a federal judge to issue a warrant for Jim, citing interstate flight to avoid prosecution. This was absurd, since Jim had left Florida before any charges had been filed, and Florida only declared him a fugitive of justice in a warrant signed by Governor Claude R. Kirk Jr. on April 18th. Fink was getting the distinct impression that somebody in the FBI wanted Jim Morrison put away in prison. The situation was extremely serious and potentially very dangerous for Jim. On or about Friday, April 4th, 1969, Jim Morrison and Max Fink arrived at the FBI's downtown Los Angeles office, where Jim was arrested. By prior arrangement, a U.S. magistrate immediately released James Douglas Morrison, an active service admiral's son and major heavy-duty American rock star, on $5,000 bail. On August 6, 1970, Jim Morrison and his entourage, lawyer Max Fink and bodyguards Babe Hill and Tony Fuentes, flew to Miami and checked into the Carlin Resort Hotel in Miami Beach. They were joined by Mike Gershman, a publicist whose Los Angeles firm also represented the Rolling Stones. The other Doors, who were expected to testify at Jim's trial, arrived a few days later. The proceedings were supposed to begin on Monday, August 10th, but were postponed for 2 days. The judge was Murray Goodman, and Jim wasn't helped by the fact that the judge hated Jim's local attorney, Robert Josephsberg, or that 62-year-old Max Fink referred to Miami as, quote, one of the most immoral cities in the United States during a press conference. The county's prosecutor was a relatively hip young assistant state attorney, Terrence McWilliams, who sucked up to Jim, asking for signed copies of his records while doing his best to send him to prison. The judge made it clear early on that he wasn't going to postpone the trial so that the Doors could play shows, so the band reluctantly canceled their European tour scheduled for early September in 1970. The whole scene in the Metro-Dade Justice Building had the stink of corruption to it. It was obvious to Miami's veteran legal observers that Jim Morrison was being railroaded to prison under the watchful eye of the Nixon administration. Somebody was out to break the Doors financially and physically, and it became apparent that no one in the media was going to stand up for Jim Morrison in his hour of need. The 6-person jury was sworn in on August 14, 1970. That night, Jim and his crew went to see John Fogerty's hard-rocking band Creedence Clearwater Revival play in Miami Beach. Then, they went to The Hump, a hotel club, to see Canned Heat play. Bob Hitt called Jim up to the stage, where he did Backdoor Man and other blues tunes for almost an hour. They had to push past the crush of TV crews, radio reporters, and fans on Monday, August 17th. The nationally famous thief, Murph the Surf, was being tried on a robbery charge in the adjacent courtroom. Jim sat at the defense table, taking notes as the testimony began. After opening statements during which Max Fink claimed the charges against Jim were baseless and motivated by unsavory local politics, 2 witnesses, Betty Racine and Colleen Clary, testified that Jim Morrison had exposed himself for 10 seconds, according to the ponytail drugstore cashier, Miss Clary. Another prosecution witness, the one who had signed the original complaint, turned out to be an employee in the prosecutor's office. Max Fink picked their stories apart during cross-examination and asked the court to be allowed to present community standards evidence exposing the jury to the public nudity of the Woodstock movie and the Miami production of Hair. The following day, photographer Jeff Simon, who was 5 feet away from Jim during the entire concert in March of 1970, where this infamous situation took place, or rather didn't take place, testified that he didn't see Jim whip it out. More than 100 of Simon's photos were introduced as evidence. On August 20th, Judge Goodman ruled that community standards were irrelevant to this case. With the jury excused, Fink excoriated the judge's ruling, drawing applause from the spectators. But the ruling stood. The Doors played 2 California shows that weekend. Friday night in Bakersfield, the kids were packed in front of the stage like penned animals, and the Doors played for 3 hours. Jim bore down, concentrating furiously, performing Celebration with careful enunciation, requesting cigarettes from the audience, and consuming maybe a gallon of beer. The next night in San Diego,
He introduced the show by yelling, "This whole thing started with rock and roll and now it's out of control." Again, the Doors played a great show, which no one would have known would be the last of its kind, the end of an era that had begun 5 years earlier in the hopeful sunshine of a summer's day on Venice Beach. Judge Goodman's Kangaroo Court reconvened on Tuesday, August 25th. A female police officer testified that the cops had been afraid to arrest Jim because they thought it would provoke a riot. Max Fink pointed out that the arrest could have been made after the show, but that nothing had happened. Fink insisted that a media-fueled hysteria had eventually forced police to file charges against an innocent artist. 2 days later, the prosecution played the jury the tape of the show, which sounded coarse, seditious, and chaotic, but offered no proof that Jim had displayed his regenerative organ. Judge Goodman then adjourned for the weekend so the Doors could perform at the Isle of Wight Festival off the south coast of England, one of the last great outdoor events of the decade. Jim Morrison was back in Miami for the resumption of the legal proceedings against him on September 2nd, 1970. The Isle of Wight show was to have been the start of a lucrative European tour that would have taken the band to Germany, Italy, Switzerland, and Paris. All the dates had been cancelled because of Jim's trial commitments. The atmosphere in off-season Miami was subdued, even morose. The scene at the trial was totally weird. The prosecution rested on September 2nd. Max Fink had 60 rebuttal witnesses. The judge ruled that he could present only 17. The next day, the judge declared an 11-day recess, infuriating the band, which had canceled its tour. The trial was costing a fortune in both money and morale. Jim wanted to return to LA because Pamela Corson sounded so stoned on the telephone, slurring her words or laughing uncontrollably, but the lawyers talked him out of it. Patricia Kennelly also arrived in Miami, claiming that Jim had married her and that she was pregnant. Jim's bodyguard, Babe, had asked him about this. "I don't know what I did," Jim told him. "I was drunk. Maybe I did, but there was no emotional involvement with her." Detention at the Carolyn Hotel was diabolical, so Jim and his crew, Babe Hill, Frank Lisiandro, and Max Fink, retreated to the Bahamas for a few days of fishing, snorkeling, and drinking rum. Back in Miami, they went to an Elvis Presley concert at the huge convention center, strobe lit by instamatic flashes, during which Elvis strutted and posed in a succession of iconic tableaux. Jim was impressed by Elvis's great band, which included guitarist James Burton, drummer Ronnie Tutt, and bassist Jerry Sheff. The local press was particularly craven about Jim's legal ordeal in their town. The Miami News reported the following. Attired in a tan suede jacket with sheepskin lining, Morrison looked like a ranch hand in search of a barber. An unidentified friend was far more flamboyantly attired in tapestry coat and rust-colored bell-bottoms, end quote. The paper sent young reporters to cover the trial, and they would approach Jim in the hallways almost on bended knee, according to Mike Gershman, as if Jim were taboo or not quite real. Their questions were shallow and useless, the TV coverage was dumb, and no one bothered to notice that a major political fix was in. Then again, a lot of people in Miami thought Jim Morrison was getting what he deserved, and maybe even what he wanted. A few months later, Jim told Rolling Stone's Ben Fong Torres, "You know, I thought there was a possibility of it becoming a major groundbreaking kind of case, but it didn't turn out that way. It actually received very little national attention. And in a way, I was kind of relieved because as the case moved on, there were no great ideals at stake." A high school student, Steve Rosenberg, attended the trial almost every day. When the crowds died out as the case dragged on, Jim noticed him in the hallways and answered Steve's respectful questions about what poetry he liked, Rimbaud, and what music he was listening to, Pink Floyd. During a recess, Jim asked if there was a Burger King around, and Steve drove him to the nearest one in his mother's '63 Chrysler Newport. Jim liked the car. "Cool air conditioning," he commented. "Really blows a lot of air." He had 2 Whoppers and a thick shake. He was fat, bearded, and a little spacey, Rosenberg recalled. "I had to draw him out. Then I just drove him back to the courthouse." Court reconvened on September 14th. The legal proceedings and witnesses were so boring that Jim stopped taking notes. Jim testified 2 days later, the other Doors the day after that. The judge was being a hard-nose and the press ignored the trial. The Doors' own publicist filed stories for Rock magazine, which came out weeks later. Jim's mood sank to a new low on September 19th when word of Jimi Hendrix's death in London got out. Jim and Babe were both tripping on acid when they heard Hendrix had died. The official version was that Hendrix had swallowed a handful of Quaaludes and had choked to death when he vomited while in a coma. But it was well known in the music business that Hendrix was leaving his manager and so was worth more dead than alive to certain people. After the moves to dismiss, denied, the closing arguments, and Judge Goodman's highly unorthodox directive to find the defendant guilty, the jury returned with its verdicts on September 20th, 1970. Jim Morrison was found guilty on misdemeanor counts of indecent exposure and open profanity.
He was acquitted of public drunkenness and of the felony charge of lewd and lascivious behavior. None of this made any sense. The whole trial had been a farce. Goodman had already commented in open court while the jury was deliberating that there was no real evidence that Jim had exposed himself. Sentencing was postponed until October. Jim's bail was raised to $50,000, and now he faced an almost certain prison sentence that could get the judge reelected as a Nixonian law and order enforcer. This new bail order came down on a Sunday evening so that it would be hard for Jim to make his bond and he could be jailed overnight. But Max Fink had been prepared for this. He had several certified bank checks in various amounts at the ready so the cops couldn't get Jim behind bars. The lawyers told Jim not to worry. They would win on appeal. Jim talked to the press after the verdict. "This won't affect my style," he told the Miami Herald. "I maintain I didn't do anything wrong." Max now told Jim to get out of Florida immediately. But Jim was in no hurry to get back to Los Angeles. Pamela had fallen apart and was in chronic heroin use. Pam was said by her friends to have been suicidally depressed in Jim's absence. Jim now elected to drive back to California with Babe Hill for company, and they took their sweet time. Jim wanted to visit his old haunts, so they stopped in Clearwater, where Jim had been in junior college. Both got thrown in jail for a few hours when Jim started a bar fight. Let loose, they drove on to Tallahassee, where an unusually nostalgic Jim stopped at the motel where he had lived as an FSU student. Then they drove straight to New Orleans, where they tarried for a few days and got, in Babe's words, as drunk as a couple of walruses. Touring the city, Jim bought a postcard at St. Louis Cathedral and mailed it to the door's office. "Don't worry," he wrote, "the end is near." Haha. Jim visited Congo Square, site of the old slave market and the place where African rhythms were first heard in America. One night he got up and jammed the blues with one of the bar bands in the French Quarter, thanking them politely when he'd sung his fill. These musicians later mutated into Kansas, a successful touring band of the early 70s. In Tennessee, Jim and Babe got busted at a speed trap. They had to follow the cop to the county courthouse, where the judge let them go for $100 in cash. In October of 1970, Jim Morrison drove into a Los Angeles scored dry by the easterly Santa Ana winds. "I see your hair is burning," he wrote. "Hills are filled with fire. If they say I never loved you, you know they are a liar."